Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. Last week we looked at the bad girls of Razorhurst. This week, you guessed it, it's the bad boys. Two of the baddest to have ever graced the streets of Sydney. First up is Mr. Guido Coletti. Now he's featured in our last episode a little bit with the bad girls. He was head over heels for Nellie and was with Dulcie for a time too, until his death, which we will go into in this episode. But to start off, let's go back to Guido's beginnings. From his rap sheet in 1933, along with one of his famous mugshots, he is listed with date of birth being the 3rd of September 1902. Height 5'7" approximately, and 161 pounds. He was not as large and hulking as some of the other underworld men, but what he lacked in stature, he made up in confidence and a bad boy attitude. He became one of the most feared men in Sydney for a time. Guido, like the women, were in trouble with the law from a young age. Guido started at a tender age of 10. Guido was born into Paddington, where at this time, being the early 1900s, it was a slum area. So, like most of the young children, they learned quickly that if you wanted more than what you had to take it yourself, which of course, like Chow Hayes and others, lands you in trouble with the law. Chow and Guido both did stints in the Gosford Boys' Home when they were kids, Chow even mentioning him briefly in his book by David Hickey. Chow stated that the Gosford Boys' Home was a breeding ground that led up to many of them being in the underworld of Sydney. If you were good at it, that is. Guido was good at it. He managed to get himself to the lead position in a gang known as the Darlinghurst Push. They were street brawlers and standover men who ruled that territory with a razor. He was in and out of court 56 times in his shortish life, charged with violent crimes like assault on police, robberies and razor slashings. He was also a pimp to the girls. He is most well known featuring in the Underbelly Razor series and for his on-again, off-again relationship with Nellie Cameron, as well as the feud over her with Frank Green. Any chance they got to steal her away from the other, they took it. Early on, Guido was working as a labourer. He also co-owned a fruit stand or fruit barrow, as well as when he was married to Nellie Cameron, he had the greengrocer. He was even married in the early 1920s and had 2 boys, Arthur and George, with a Lillian hair. Thankfully, as far as we can see, the boys were not involved in breaking the law. Someone in Ancestry has Guido linked to an Ada Matilda Baker, having a son Albert John Kavanagh with him. So that's quite interesting also. I'm not too sure how accurate that is, but it also lists Guido's parents as Evedy Haggie and Hugh Calletti. So that was an interesting find. Guido wasn't scared to get into it with other nasty types, and this is unfortunately where he meets his end. Just hours after attending his grandmother's funeral, and most likely angry and alcohol-fueled, he takes his then lady, Dulcie, with him to a party in Brougham Street where members of the Brougham Street gang were holding a party. Guido had an altercation previously with members from the Brougham Street group, but at the time they must have feared him or been on better terms with him to have let him inside the premises and as part of the party. He was there for some time with Dulcie before it is believed he got into an argument with one of the members of the Brougham Street gang. Obviously fearing their lives, Guido was shot in the abdomen, and a taxi driver, it is believed, called police from one of the police phone booths. these phone boxes were linked to the nearest station. Detectives arrived at the location, and then an ambulance was called. This lengthy amount of time before Guido saw medical attention was most likely why he died. There were many gangsters that were shot at this time in many different areas, and they all survived. But Guido's luck had run out. He was taken to St Vincent's Hospital, and this is where he died shortly after, around 10 o'clock that evening. But not before police questioned him, to which he was tight-lipped about his murderer. As we know, Nellie was his wife at the time, but she was in Queensland and unable to attend his funeral, in which Dulcie attended, as she was his lady at the time. But we do know that Nellie returned to Sydney shortly after his murder, and it is believed that she pressured a witness into not giving evidence in Guido's murder. Perhaps she had been warned herself. It was believed that she found the witness, who was in hiding at the time, so she must have had help either from those protecting the witness or from the Brougham Street gang to clear their name. Either way, Guido Coletti was dead. He was in his mid-30s and had left a legacy behind. Not a good one, but he is remembered. And being featured in the Underbelly Razor series means he will be remembered for a long while yet. And I am sure he would have been happy with that. Now on to Guido's rival, Frank Green, or Francis Donald Green. He was born around the same time as Guido, if we trust the criminal history sheets, but there are various birth years that have been recorded for Frank. The criminal sheet states it was 1902, but it has also been recorded as 1905. He may have even lied to police back then, which would make his 1923 mugshot aged 18, not 21. But he seems older than 18. Now, Frank Green was called the Little Gunman, as the Gunman name was already being used for Kate Lee's man, Gregory Gaffney, or Gunman Gaffney. Frank was hired by Tilly as her gunman, hence he was also given the title Gunman. But Frank was only 5'5", that was shorter even than Guido, who was at almost 5'7". So perhaps Frank was the Little Gunman for his height also. I couldn't find where Frank grew up, but like others who were involved in this life, it was most likely that he grew up in poor Sydney. There were a lot of mean kids and street gangs. Only the worst rose to the top. Chow Hayes mentions Frank in his biography, written by David Hickey, as being a smart-mouthed guy and quick-tempered. Chow was younger than Frank by almost a decade, Chow born in 1911. So at the time of the Razor Wars, Chow was in his late teens, so that's possibly why he wasn't in the series at all. Still rough, maybe hadn't made a name for himself as yet, but Frank and Guido were in their late 20s. Frank still got a beating from Chow, as per his book, and lands himself in hospital. But it was never mentioned to the police. And Guido was never charged with murder, but police believed he was responsible for about 4 murders. Frank, on the other hand, was not shy about whipping out a gun or a razor, and even copped a razor slice to his right cheek before the Razor Wars were in full swing. And Chow, well, he did hard time for murder, and that's why we featured him first as our original gangster. Frank sported the lovely scar in his 1923 mugshot and gained the name Scarface at the time as a result. No wonder he was quick-tempered. He was described in his prime as being an undersized yet homicidal alcoholic and cocaine addict, known for murdering Bernard Hugh Barney Dalton, who was actually older than how they portrayed him in Underbelly Razor. He was a footy star for the eastern suburbs around 1911 to 1913, and when he was murdered, he was an ex-footy star and sadly was involved with Kate Lee's gang. By 1929, things were going pretty well for Frank Green. He was married in 1928 to a Dorothea May Liddell and has 2 children with her, both girls. He also has a girlfriend on his arm, Miss Nellie Cameron. But following a fight between Nellie and another prostitute, Black Aggie, we think, who was seeing Greg Gaffney at the time, at least that was how it was portrayed in the Underbelly Razor series, where Nellie was the victor, a fight breaks out between both gunmen. As a result, Frank is shot by Greg Gaffney and flees to the Divine residence where he's been living, in Maroubra, for backup. Gaffney wants to finish the job. From the Underbelly Razor scenes, we know there was a shootout outside of the Divine residence. Kate's guys, Gaffney and Wally Tomlinson, and possibly Barney and others, were outside the residence, calling out for Frank Green to show himself so he can be shot, I guess. Big Jim Devine threatens that he'll start shooting if they don't leave, which they don't, and Gaffney starts coming up toward the premises, and Big Jim shoots Gaffney, fatally wounding him. He also shoots at Wally Tomlinson, but he and the other men get away. Gaffney bleeds out on the Divine lawn. Due to the altercation outside the Maroubra residence of the Divines, word on the street is that they're both out for each other. Whoever shoots the other first wins. Kill or be killed. This mess ends up with Frank firing on Wally Tomlinson and Barney Dalton outside the Strand. Frank and Jim were meant to do the job, but Jim freezes up at the last moment, and Frank ends up shooting both Barney, dead, and wounding Wally seriously. While Wally is recovering in hospital, he is devastated about his mate Barney's death and tells police who did it, which is breaking the gangster code. He names Frank Green and Jim Devine as the murderers. Jim tries to leave Frank in the poo, and luckily, due to witness statements that left reasonable doubt as to whom the murderers were, the case was dumped. Wally leaves town. However, not as all as it seems. 1931, Frank is still upset that Jim didn't back him, and before long, Frank and Jim are at odds. Now, Jim's 10 years older than Frank, and a lot taller, but Frank's pretty mean, and he decides that after Jim refuses to give him some money for Frank handling the situation for him, Frank decides to rob Jim's place. Frank turns up at the Divine residence with Nellie Cameron. They go inside along with taxi driver Herbert Moffat and sit down. They discuss what money Frank believes he is owed from the whole thing, and when Jim refuses to pay him any, he pulls out a gun and puts it into Jim's stomach, stating that he'd shoot him if he doesn't get paid. Big Jim states that Frank, at gunpoint, puts his hand into Jim's pocket and pulls out an expensive tie pin. Still at gunpoint, they leave the premises. Jim, now very enraged, grabs his gun and starts shooting. Unfortunately, poor Herbert Moffat is caught in the crossfire and loses his life. Now, Herbert Moffat was actually Jim Devine's friend, so he's pretty upset about the whole thing, having shot his mate. He was given a verdict of not guilty after going to trial. Due to Frank Green's armed robbery on his place, it was considered self-defence. And sadly for poor Herbert, there was no justice in his death. Frank went into hiding, but was located by police over the robbery. The case was dropped, being that the court saw it as a he said case. Not long after this, Frank Green is shot in 1932 by a Charles George Brame, a Sydney musician who, after being shot himself in 1929 by gang members, was carrying around a gun, and when he got into an altercation with Frank, probably fearing his safety, shot him. The altercation was probably over Nellie, as it was portrayed in Underbelly Razor. Frank almost dies from these injuries. Doctors didn't give him much hope at all, but pulls through. The case against the musician is dropped as, well, it was Frank Green, the worst gunman, versus a scared Sydney musician. Go figure. As with many of the underworld figures, part of being released from jail was that they had to leave the state. Kate Lee went out back where she grew up until he went back home to the UK from where she came. But both women ended up back in Sydney. Well, Frank Green goes to sunny Queensland, but he doesn't stay out of trouble there. He's involved in a brawl and charged. Eventually he comes back to Sydney, and in 1937 was charged with intent to shoot a police officer. It was later dropped, as he was really drunk at the time. As the war years progressed, Frank went silent. I couldn't find any information that he went away to war. Nothing more is really said about Frank Green until Nellie Cameron's funeral in 1953. Now, she'd been married to Guido and separated from Guido. She took her own life, and Frank Green attended the funeral. However, he too would be dead in 3 years. In 1956, he was murdered by his then girlfriend, a Beatrice May Bowles, or Bowes. They were living in Paddington. She was 40 and he was 55. There was obvious domestic violence between them. Beatrice claimed that he was nagging her, and she just reacted by grabbing a foot-long knife and stabbing him through the chest into his heart at the dinner table. They ruled it as self-defence, as she had also stated that it was the very same knife he'd used on her at Christmas. Wow. She also said, "I killed him. I wish they would hang women. They could put a rope around my neck right now." I couldn't find any other information about Beatrice, only about the murder, so it is quite possible she just moved on with her life. Frank Green was cremated, and his unclaimed ashes were scattered over a rose garden in the eastern suburbs Memorial Park. Green was survived by his 2 daughters and Dorothea. He is still very much remembered, even 67 years after his death. Wow, what stories. Well, these 2 died, as they were always going to, violently, and at the hands of other people. We hope you enjoyed this episode on Guido Coletti and Frank Green. We do have another one that's coming about some of the members of the Razor Gang. We're not completely finished yet. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next Razor episode.